Hello, my name is Alan Cross, and welcome to the next part of my kitchen lecture series, where we're back in the kitchen now, so it's more authentically kitchen. But today we're going to deal with part two, which is a follow up to a lecture I gave on autism and talking about the symptoms and the nature of the learning disorder. So I felt there was a lot more that we could contribute in terms of putting positivity back into the autism debate. So today we're going to deal with techniques that can help autism and come to a greater understanding of how, if you're autistic, how you can confront the condition. So, first of all, we'll give you an outline. Autism is a learning disorder that affects your ability to empathize, and when it affects your ability to empathize, it affects your cognition or your understanding, the amount you can understand from language and from how you can access language. And then in language, there are a lot of grey areas that can be very unclear to do with, for example, using the same word in a different way or in a different sense, or the language that we actually choose when we're trying to understand something importantly affects how much we can understand. And the problem with autism is that people they're too close to their ego in terms of their psychology, and therefore their personalities are very self-orientated, but unfortunately their empathy is inwardly focused rather than having great abilities to understand externally. So they become very internally focused in their empathy. So it affects their ability to empathize with others and understand other people's emotions, but also access language and also actually use language in an accurate enough way in order to get distance from their emotions. Because remember, we're dealing with empathy in a very inwardly focused way, and therefore the language we choose and our cognition tends to be biased towards ourselves rather than having a balance of being able to evaluate using other people's language and terminology. Um, we're, 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 we're blocked by ourselves if we're autistics, for example. So, how do we deal with this block? Let's keep positive, don't get negative about this. Right. Today, we're going to learn techniques to cope with autism based around looking at the condition and looking at how we can use our brains to compensate and to unlock the condition. Because in some ways, within language is locked emotions, preconceptions, assumptions. It's all locked within a box of language. And central to autism is the notion of confusion or putting things together the in a wrong way or in a way that suggests something different from if you put it together in a different way. Because I mean, you might say there is no right or wrong way, and I would concur, but there are ways that can help you understand, and the ways that you can understand a great deal less in confusion. And with confusion comes anger release, because you see, with autistic people find it difficult to process their emotions, to understand their emotions with the help of other people, because you see that support is cut off with problems with empathy, and therefore autistic people tend to release their anger with that confusion, with that frustration at understanding, and with a difficulty to understand emotions and a more internally biased emotion or internally looking emotion, it can cause great emotional instability, which leads back to the anger release from the confusion. And like starting a journey with the first step in the wrong direction, this leads to more confusion and more confusion and more anger and more anger release. And within autistics, there's a very strong need to control. I mean, joking about society, people say you're a control freak. Well, autistic people are control freaks, and they tend to need to manipulate the world around them, or feel that they need to manipulate, purely because they don't have the abilities in other ways, and therefore they're trying to compensate for this empathy gap. Okay, because they're too close to themselves. Right. So let's start off with some techniques to actually confront autism. Thought technique number one. Right, you have to look out for the warning signs. Now, the warning signs could be phrases like, "What do you mean? I do not understand," or strong emotions that you're unsure about. Uh, For example, in releasing anger, getting the wrong end of the stick, they used to say that when somebody's trying to explain something to you, if you come to an assumption very quickly with anger, or it's something you do not understand that leads to anger release, or or you're not sure about something, this is the first step. Now, the main mistake autistic people make is they don't feel it's their fault because they've got a learning disorder, they're having trouble, and that's true, but they automatically assume it's somebody else's fault when they don't entertain the possibility that it's not anybody's fault. Nobody is responsible that they don't understand. It's just something that happens in life. But the more you're prone to release anger with confusion, the more you lead yourself down a path of greater confusion. And this affects your self-esteem, your ability to have confidence in yourself. It can trigger frustrations throughout your life at troubles you've had of understanding or confusion or struggling within this box of autism. And we've already said this box of autism is boxes of language. So our first technique is, with this warning sign, you must say to yourself, autism. Now, we've already established it doesn't have to be somebody else's fault, even though it's not your fault. And anger and frustration at not understanding, you you have to deal with these situations that are grey areas in life. Now, autistic people, when they spend a lot of time by themselves, they tend to develop what's called a binary intelligence, which is basically that you have to fit something into one box rather than another. If you think about computer machine code, it's either a zero or one. But regardless of what sequences, it's a zero of one or another. And autistic people, with this lack of ability to access the experience and the understanding of others' empathy, they tend to become very focused on this binary way of thinking. And therefore, when you think it's not your fault, you automatically assume it's somebody else's fault. And that leads down the path of anger, confusion, release. So we've got to put the brakes on right there and then. You must develop discipline that when you see those warning signs, you stop and you say to yourself, this is my autism. Now, you might say, well, what does that magically do? What does it magically do? Well, you become conscious of the fact that it's your cognition that's been affected rather than something that you've understood that doesn't make sense in the outside world. None of it makes sense because your powers of empathy are impaired. And therefore, if you can just have the discipline to say, okay, this is my autism, that stops you going down the path of becoming greater confused and greater confused. It stops you immediately releasing that anger and that emotion as some solution, as some kind of attributing of responsibility. It makes you pause for a second and actually look at yourself, because you can only deal with one thing at a time, and dealing with what people are saying in the outside world, you have to get yourself right before you can start trying to bridge that gap of empathy. So, stopping down the path of confusion, saying to yourself, look, this can't make sense, this must be autism, you can actually head off in another direction. You can actually start to understand more than you would have understood going down that path. Okay. And down that path is anxiety, anger, a feeling of not understanding and uncertainty. It can trigger off lots of different parts of your condition, such as anxiety, OCD. And you can see the links between conditions in that anger release from confused emotional understanding is a type of OCD. Autism links in with OCD in that, in an analogous sense. And Tourette's is another condition that, links in with OCD, the releasing of something that, you don't have control over, just like the anger of the kind of like autistics try and deal with their emotions through. Right, so there's technique one. Put the brakes on. Right, the answer to the first step is skepticism, because what I want you to put in place of that anger and that confusion is skepticism. There must be a reason why it doesn't make sense. Now, that doesn't have to be your fault. Autistic people can be very sensitive about responsibility in that they feel they're being blamed for things that aren't their fault, but it's not necessarily your fault. You just have to acknowledge that you've got a condition. And acknowledging that you've got a condition is a reason for skepticism. It's a reason for not assuming what your emotions, what your anger, what your blaming behavior suggests. The reaction, it puts a pause on the reaction, right? So it's not necessarily somebody's fault, even if it's not your fault. Right. So recognizing the condition in yourself and taking steps to mitigate or try and cope with the situation in a more productive way rather than a less productive way, which anger release, confusion, it is a type of coping, but there can be a better way of coping, and that's learning to understand yourself and your condition. Right, and acceptance is a big part of this. If you look into Stoicism, Stoicism can help you a massive amount with the notion of acceptance, the importance of accepting your condition, and accepting that there just isn't an easy solution or an easy person to blame in life. It's not your fault, but life is our own responsibility, and you're not separate from that. Responsibility doesn't equal blame. It just means when you reach a point like this, where you can take responsibility, or you can start to want to accept and deal with your condition, it's taking the opportunity when you can do it. It's not necessarily blame, because we don't understand everything in our lives when we're born. Life has to unfold. And it's not necessarily somebody wanting to antagonize or blame you. The fact that people would want you to act with responsibility. And you can use techniques when this warning sign goes off, autism. On the channel, there's resources for meditation, mindfulness, mantra meditation with gongs. And even if you feel like you're too full of energy, there's emotional therapy through the mixes and educational therapy. And you've got to see yourself and your behavior in the patterns that it follows, in the language that you repeat, in the language that you choose. You've got to sort of see yourself from the outside functioning in repetition. And when you struggle with your condition, these behaviors do come in repetition. And all our behaviors come in repetition. I mean, I say at the beginning of this video, hello, I'm Alan Cross. I said that last time. Life does go in circles, but you have to be able to take a step back and want to have a great understanding of your condition, to recognize your condition, and to realize that even if it's not your fault, you're the only one who can help yourself. That's what being in a very self-orientated world is. You'll only listen to yourself. It's a sad fact of reality, but it's also hope. And it's all encoded in language, in the language that we use, and in the behavior patterns that we repeat. And we never seem to find our way out of those boxes. So let's actually use a very powerful psychological method called neuro-linguistic programming in order to confront the main thrust of what we're dealing with, language. Because behavior is programmed with language. And that is the principles of neuro-linguistic programming. Right. When we have problems with empathy, we very often have problems with language, because language is our currency of understanding in the world, what we offer to others, what others offer to us, how we communicate. And therefore, language really is the point where you can confront autism, where you can confront emotional disorders in general. And I recommend that a counsellor is somebody who you have as a sounding board to do this, but you can do a certain amount by yourself, and a counsellor can be somebody who you can unburden your experiences, but also gain that step back, that view of yourself externally, which you need to help yourselves. And language can be boxes of confusion, but it's the keys we use to understand the world is these boxes of confusion or ambiguity. And therefore, understanding the language that you use and why you use that language can unlock greater perspectives and greater understanding of how you can see past that powerful emotional language. Because and neuro-linguistic programming the emphasis on the language we use and the language we choose to use is directly affects how much and what kind of horizons of understanding our cognition can have. Words can be incredibly limiting, but they can also release us from the limiting nature of the words. They're kind of the lock, but also the key. Um, and our assumptions can be programmed within language. Our assumptions that can go back many years are crystallized in the language we use and the way in which we use it and the meaning in which we try and imbue in the language. I mean, on my course, I'd speak about well, not me speak about, but there's material about post-structuralism, and post-structuralism deals with the signifier and the signified, and it speaks about language in terms of, you know, what something's trying to indicate and what is the baggage that's within it that's trying to be communicated through the language, like the vehicle, like the car, and the the baggage, like the airport, what is trying to be conveyed through or signified. um, but you can go into more detail with that with I think it's in part 3 of the university course. But um, and therefore, within this baggage, this is our access to freedom and to a new point of view, to be able to unlock and understand ourselves a lot better from the language. Why we choose language, why we pick one word over another, the way in which we use language can actually tell us a lot about ourselves, and it can unlock the empathy that an autistic person has trouble dealing with. Therefore, you can see why this is our second technique to deal with autism, is to unlock the language that contains our greater understanding that as autistics we're missing out on, or autistic people, that is. For example, let's give an example, because you might say, well, words are a bit woolly. All of that kind of made sense, but also kind of didn't. Well, how do we unlock this box of language? Well, I thought the example I picked was the word fact. And I mean, you might easily say, well, you're fact, but I mean, do we get much further? I mean, does language say one thing or does it say many things? Because fact is, the literal sense is cooking oil, is polyunsaturates and saturates in margarine, is fact quite literally is, a biological compound. And therefore we're using language in a different way from a literal biological compound. And therefore the baggage that the word fact has is being insinuated or packed into the suitcase of what somebody wants you to think. It's a form of control. The connotations and the insinuations that people use with language, because they're not talking about cooking oil, they're talking about something that they want to insinuate. And that insinuation is anger, is hatred, and is meant to provoke self-hatred, hatred of your own inadequacies in terms of your body image, the way you feel people will see you around, the way your self-esteem, your self-worth. But somebody is wanting to program rebuke into that word fact and pile it full of, hatred. And you might say, well, why would they do that? And it's because of something called normativity. Now, normativity is society's general idea of what is normal. And normativity can be a crushing force that brutally extracts those who aren't normal and puts on a pedestal or gives a pat on the back those who fit into a body image or a normal normal spectrum of weight. But why do we use the word fat? I mean, there's the word overweight, which in a literal sense says you're over your recommended weight. But people don't use that. People don't want the literal meaning that comes along because they prefer ambiguity to pile up the suitcases with this baggage. And therefore, the word fat in a functional sense functions for bullying. But because people use it in a synonym with overweight, or in the same way as the word overweight, they, they, they disguise this bullying behind a literal sense that isn't there because it's not cooking oil, right? And we punish ourselves with the weapons that others use, language, how they stuff this suitcase full of what they want you to think, what opinions they want you to have, what rebuke, what hatred they want you to have, how they're programming you in a neuro linguistic sense. And we punish ourselves with these words. And eating disorders develop out of emotional problems, thyroid problems, relationship problems, all kinds of mental illness associates out and causes eating disorders. And but that isn't exactly cooking oil, is it? Can you see how insinuating being over your weight is the same thing as cooking oil? It's bullying, but you can see how other people lock up their anger and their rebuke and their hatred within language and try and get you to punish yourself with that language. Okay, so there's an example of of how language locked up within language is the intentions of others, the hatred of others, what they're trying to program into you. But remember, if you're autistic, you have trouble accessing or empathizing the meanings and the connotations and the grey areas that others mean. And therefore you can punish yourself more without understanding the broader context of they're just copying other people in society. It's society's effect of normativity, of rebuke. But autistics are much more vulnerable because they get back to that point where they don't understand and the warning light autism doesn't go on. Anyway, and therefore, so to a certain extent, you can help yourself a great deal in life if you can deprogram yourself of all these words that exist in your mind. When other language can be used, greater understanding can be given, more neutral language can be used, and the voices of people trying to program you with their hatred, disappointment, anger, you can get another perspective on this construction you've built up of yourself, because language is central to how we understand ourselves, communication, and language can be an incredible weakness for autistic people. But it's also the key that we can start to approach the problem. Now, it helps if you can have a piece of paper and write down emotive language that's in your thoughts, and also write down and express your feelings with paper. Now, this can have a bad effect if you dwell too much upon that paper, but if you can put that paper to one side and just express yourself like a counselor, looking at that paper in the future can give you greater insights that you might not have off the top of your head. And you can understand your feelings from a point of view of being beyond that point in time. Um, and if you look at the language you use in the thoughts about yourselves and others, the language that you describe yourself with, and the language that you understand others. These can be the keys to going beyond that language, going beyond the limitations and the, the shortcomings and the ambiguities fundamentally of that language. Because autistic people can get very frustrated with ambiguities and feel that people are wronging them. But ambiguities can be the most important thing in understanding because they teach you that language is more complicated. Connotations, that there's a whole story to unpack that isn't expressed within one word taken at face value by an autistic person. And why people choose words and why you choose words, you can unlock a whole world of understanding yourself, understanding the narrative, the story of the person that actually had those experiences, had those frustrations, but also isn't understanding the way in which other people are using language, what's locked up in their boxes of language, and the effect that your parents have when they program you when you're growing up, the way you learn about yourself so fundamentally in childhood that you get a lot of the tools that you use throughout your whole life in childhood. And remember, I said philosophy was very much about forming different tools and using different tools of thought. If you watch my lecture on what is philosophy, that might clarify that. Now, with your piece of paper, an important technique you can use is a spider diagram. And by this, I don't mean an anatomical picture of a spider. I mean, at the center, you put a circle and you write your word in there, say fact. And then the legs of the spider all come from that source. And you can start to explain and unpack what's behind that word using a spider diagram. Just speaking honestly about your emotions, but also about things that don't make sense. Like, so you might write fat and say, I'm not cooking oil. Now that's an important thing because you're saying the literal sense of the word is wrong and it's being used synonymically with the word overweight, where the literal sense of the word is basically what the word is. But because people confuse this with language, as an autistic, it helps to unpack and using a spider diagram to take off all the different branches and divide one word into all the different parts. You know, this is how you can start to bridge the gap, and this is how you can start to deprogram yourself of all the words that have made you so unhappy down the years. All the you can start to confront the issues that you you don't want to confront, but they can be they can be blocked by confusion. And spider diagrams, you can understand the connotations or the extra meanings of the word, and you can see language more in its complexity that doesn't really take place in a conversation when an autistic person is speaking to somebody. It isn't unpack this suitcase. The suitcase is they're just being chucked at you, and it's very difficult to assess things at the time, and therefore you can't blame yourself or get angry at yourself about the confusion. And you can see how others might understand that language in a different way, in that what's signified, the word, the signifier, the word, two people can have two different ideas of what's signified or what's meant by that word. And therefore, you can use techniques to break down your autism rather than going past that warning sign, I don't understand. And you can start to see what emotions are loaded in words, like hatred with the word fat, and and depression, and really negative feelings are all programmed into that synonym between overweight and fat. But language can be incredibly inaccurate. It can have creative connotations. It's just autistic people tend to want to look at a language and say, or at language and say, look, this must be something you can literally unpack. You can look at the meanings of the components, and therefore it'll have a literal sense. And in the word overweight, it does have a literal sense. But people use the word fat, which doesn't have a literal sense, and they use it in the same way. And language is horribly complicated with ambiguity. And that is terrible for autistic people, but you can't give up. There are techniques that you can use your brain because your IQ is no lower than anybody else's. You've just got all the ability, but not the actual non-disability. You've got a disability blocking your abilities. Now, what emotions are loaded in the words that you write down? Well, how do they relate to your history and your life? How do they relate to your how you learn to understand the world? How do they, unpacking language? It's just not something that's very easy to do in conversation, and autistic people struggle greatly. But if you've just got a pen and a piece of paper, it's amazing the progress you can make. Um, so our reason for confusion is well, the weakest link is language, but it can also be our strongest tool. Remember, it's a box, but it's also a key to the box using other language. And using more accurate language can benefit autistic people so much. Unfortunately, language is very informal, very confusing, and autistic people need better teaching and clearer teaching. And they just find it harder to scrape by. The school system can be the worst thing because the patchy teaching can be the worst off with that patchy teaching because everything just isn't clear enough. And when language is very powerfully emotional, you know, looking into that language, into that word, is a window into your soul. It's a window into greater understanding of things that happened in the past that you might not understand. And this can help you control anger. Just the word autism, the warning sign, stop down that path. Because meditation and emotional therapy on the cat, in conjunction with learning, because learning is so important for autistic people, they need to carry on learning. And philosophy is a incredibly powerful weapon for an autistic person to actually start understanding. It's just autistic people, they don't have a natural ability in philosophy. It can be harder for them to understand without things being clear and being laid out. But to unpack something like language, is it anybody's fault? Thank you very much for listening.